Welcome to this new episode of the Positive Leadership Podcast. I'm so excited to introduce today's guest, who is the perfect example of a genuinely optimistic mind. She's a researcher, author, and above all, an environmental scientist recognized globally for a strong focus on data-driven environmental research, particularly in sustainability and climate change. She has an incredible ability to communicate complex scientific concepts to a broader audience, something I believe is essential today, by the way, for fostering global awareness and engagement. As head of research at Our World in Data, she analyzes topics related to energy, the environment, and food systems, and many other things, actually. Recently, she released a fantastic book, Not the End of the World. Please go and read it, where she delves into what may be her primary motivations, the conviction that, despite the widespread pessimism, we can be the first generation to build a truly sustainable planet. Very warm welcome, Hannah Ritchie. I'm so happy to welcome you today.
It's great to be here. Thanks very much for having me.
So, Hannah, I usually like to start by discussing my guest's family, childhood background, to understand how those early experiences help shape the future career paths and your values as well. And I think you're part of the generation that grew up amid the rising awareness of environmental issues and climate change. And so I'd love really to get starting talking about what was it for you as a kid with your parents, your community, and the kind of memories you have of maybe some of the moments who shaped who you are today.
Yeah, so I'm from, if you can't tell by the accent, I'm from Scotland.
Yes.
I'm from a little town called Falkirk, right in the middle of Scotland. And I think in terms of upbringing, I had a very happy upbringing. I think my parents supported me and my brother very well. I have an older brother, which maybe shaped part of my tenacity. And yeah, so I think I came from a very supportive household. I think my parents were very much from a working class generation, and I'd say maybe them raising us, we were kind of the first ladder up to kind of middle class or lower middle class. So I'd say in terms of upbringing, I had quite a comfortable upbringing in terms of money and support, but not to the extent of being kind of luxurious. Like I think my parents were quite measured about it. Like me and my brother would never have gone to private school. We had a family car, but it was a second-hand car. So I'd say comfortable, but not luxurious. Yeah. And I think in terms of the work that I do now, I think my parents actually had quite a big influence. I mean, not necessarily in terms of the focus on environment, but I think the approach that I take to problems and my career. So my dad is an engineer, and I think from very early on, he kind of instilled in me this sense of critical thinking and challenging assumptions. Yeah. And when I was a kid, that was quite annoying. But I think that's been passed on to me in some form. And I think in terms of the values that they instilled in us, I think just really some of the core ones was work hard and contribute to society in some way. Not necessarily materialistic or go out and make lots of money, but try to have a positive impact in some way. And they weren't prescriptive about what that should be. But I think that was a kind of underlying motivation, like try and help people and try and contribute in a positive way. So I think that's where my parents came in. As you say, I kind of feel like I've kind of grown up as the kind of generation where climate change has been the core thing. And I think it's hard to pinpoint a specific time where, it was a realization of, there's this massive problem. I think it was growing over time. But for me, it was kind of an underlying worry for a lot of my childhood and started to peak when I got into my early teens. So I specifically remember when I was 12 or 13 in school, as part of our kind of oral English exam, we had to give a talk to our class. And a lot of the other students in the class were, picking one of their favorite hobbies. But I got up to speak about climate change. And I remember...
You did?
I did. And I remember holding up maps of, this is what the world will look like at 2 degrees and 3 degrees and 4 degrees. And you could see this coastlines getting sucked up by sea level rise. So, I was very much worried about that very early on.
And what was the reaction of the kids in the school, the teachers, as you talked about that? Was there a consensus and shared I would say appreciation of the environment by your friends in the school? Or
I think to give them credit, they were 12 years old, so
yeah,
maybe it wasn't top of mind. I think climate change, when I gave that talk, didn't have the coverage that it does now.
For sure.
So I think it was still growing at that time. I think they probably thought, oh, this is an interesting choice of subject. I kind of just scared the rest of my classmates.
And do you remember actually back home then, maybe after this talk, or maybe a couple of years ago, after that, I would say, as you became a teenager as well, any kind of heated debates within your own family about climate change, and maybe even some changes you like your parents or brother to do because you you believe that was not right, and you need to do something different?
Yeah, I mean, I think they've always been very supportive of what I've been interested in, and I think.
Yep.
I mean, my dad is very scientific, so he gets it very immediately and gets the problem and gets what the solutions are. In my book, it's become like a bit of a theme that I throw as we say in Scotland, I throw my brother under the bus a few times. So I discuss some of his kind of behaviours around climate change and actually how that shifted. And one of the key points I make there is that my brother's probably a little bit concerned about climate change, definitely not to the extent that I am, but he has over time taken up more sustainable or low carbon behaviours. Like I discussed that he is the first in the family to get an electric car. And it's not necessarily that he got an electric car because he's really, really worried about climate change. He got an electric car because electric cars are cool to him.
Okay, right? That was a good factor as well.
So he likes Teslas. So he got a Tesla, right? And I think that, for me, that's also a core part of the message that I try to get across is that when we're trying to promote low carbon behaviors or more sustainable behaviors, we also need to link it to other stuff that people care about. So they care about cool stuff, they care about cost, they care about ease and convenience. So some of his behavioral shifts have been around trying to link that up with other stuff that he cares about.
Yeah, so it becomes actually part of their lifestyle. I think makes a lot of sense. I know that in some interviews, Anna, you mentioned that at first you felt quite anxious about climate change. You even shared that after earning your BSc in Environmental Geoscience and MSc in Carbon Management from the University of Edinburgh, you left university feeling hopeless. All you could see were actually problems: global warming, starving polar bears, air pollution, deforestation, and more, with seemingly no solutions in sight. You even said, I believed, I was living through humanity's most tragic period. Wow. So how did you manage to shift your mindset from anxiety and hopelessness to a firm belief that actually real solutions are possible? And was there a particular moment again where either from the outside, maybe a mentor, helped you guide your thinking during this personal transformation?
Yeah, so as you say, I studied environmental science at university, and there the course wasn't just focused on climate change. I mean, that's part of the problem. You know, when we look at environmental problems, there are many, and it's not just about climate change. So I think kind of studying in that environment, especially from a scientific perspective, you're just kind of bombarded with, bad result after bad result after bad result. And I think at that time, what was really key is that I was also becoming quite obsessive about the news. So I felt like to stay informed about the world, the best way to do that was to read the news every 30 minutes because I had to know what was going on so I could stay updated.
Any particular news channels at the time you were watching, reading, and maybe that you switch away from today?
At the time, I was very big on The Guardian.
Oh, Guardian, okay.
And I think and sometimes The Guardian does very good climate and environment coverage. They do a lot of it. But for me, that was not helpful. And it was very much being bombarded again with just disaster after disaster after disaster.
Yeah.
So I think the combination of those things kind of left me feeling pretty hopeless about our ability to tackle any of these massive problems that I was studying. I think one other key issue there is that I was studying environmental change and the trends were very much going in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And I was extrapolating that to human development and human progress.
Yes.
So because I saw climate change getting worse and air pollution getting worse and all of these problems, I assumed based on the news that poverty was getting worse, and child mortality was getting worse, and hunger was getting worse. So just everything was going in
all
the
the
wrong direction.
17 UN SDG goals, basically, right?
Just everything in the world was getting worse and worse and worse, and therefore I was just living in the kind of the worst period of history ever. And I think one of the key turning points for me was discovering the work of a Swedish statistician called Hans Rosling.
Oh yeah, please talk about it, because I think we saw the same video actually at the time.
Yeah, so he sadly passed away in 2017, but he had a big impact on my thinking. And he would give these TED Talks or talks at big events where he would really use data to show how trends have changed over time, or human progress has changed over time. So not looking at individual newspaper headlines, but zooming out to see how has the world changed over the last 200 years. And really, when you do that, what you see is that we've actually just made amazing progress on many measures, from extreme poverty to child mortality to maternal mortality to life expectancy. Like the list goes on and on. Now, that, to be clear, that doesn't mean things are fine or we don't have a lot more work to do, but we've made amazing progress. The problem is that I was oblivious to any of these positive developments, right? Because I never got taught this in school. I never got taught it in university. I never saw it on the news. So the only way that you would really find this information is if you deliberately went out to look for data on this, which
searching for it.
Hadn't. So that was a key turning point for me, not necessarily because that meant that environmental trends were getting better, because they weren't. But for me, it was this kind of light switch that maybe humans are not completely hopeless. And we have the capacity to solve really hard problems. And the way I think about this is that when we look at climate change, for example, today, and we look into the future, it seems like a really unsurmountable challenge. It seems incredibly difficult for us to see how we'll get out of this. But I think if you were to think about our ancestors in 1800, the notion that we could slash child mortality to an incredibly low level, again, for them would have seemed impossible or
unbelievable. Yes.
So I think that kind of changed my framework around our ability to tackle these problems.
And to have an impact, Just for our listeners, because I think it'd be wonderful for them to watch a famous video I watched at the time. I'd been using myself in a couple of presentations in my former global leadership role, because I was managing all subsidiaries around the world. He did this YouTube video in 2010 where he used data, data visualization in a very innovative way. And I think it was in less than 3 minutes. You could see the growth and degrowth, whatever, but the growth and maturity evolution of countries by GDP and population over 200 years. It was fascinating to see those bubbles of countries like China, of course, coming from nowhere and then becoming that big economic powerhouse, and other countries on the other side doing the country, and so on and so forth. So how did that actually influence your choice to become a data scientist? Because it's all about data at the end of the day. And the power of data is strong. But as you rightly said as well, it's all about the way to visualize data. I think seeing is believing. And also picking the data, which is also debatable, of course. Which data do you pick to tell a story? And we know that. So we know that it helps to get some good data, but sometimes there's the other side of the coin. So tell us more about that movement of in your studies and going to data and data science as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was two elements to it. I think the first was it just sparked my interest in using data to understand the world. Like, it was just very obvious to me, like, of course I can't form a worldview from newspaper headlines. I need to go out and look for the data to truly understand these problems and how they've changed over time. So I could have done that in private, and that would have been useful in itself just for my own understanding. But from his work, I also understood the power of being able to communicate in that way and shape people's worldview in that way. And I think it's very, very rare to have that talent to do it, right? Most people, when they see data, they're put off, they don't like it, or they feel like they don't understand it, right? I mean, that's what puts a lot of people off. They think it's too complex. Whereas what Hans Rosling did was really promote it in an engaging way, in an understandable way. So that was a big inspiration for me realizing, once I got my head around a problem, to some extent, once I used the data to get my own head around a problem, it seemed selfish not to try to share that with other people to help guide their understanding or to guide global understanding of these issues. So these two things kind of came together. One, using the data to understand, and then to communicate. So hopefully it informs us to push for more progress or be able to tackle these problems.
Do you recall actually an example early on as you evolve your approach again to environment with data science of a problem that you picked where, as you search the data and the truth in the data, between cuts, that changed your mind about a specific issue on environment? Is there one of such issues coming to your mind which was something that you believe so strongly on, probably in a pessimistic way, and then you said, well, this is actually not really what happened or what's happening there?
I mean, I think maybe part of this was the focus of my PhD, actually, where the focus of my PhD was looking through data at a high level about the global food system, right? And what I was trying to do in my PhD was answer this pretty big question of, can we feed 8 or 9 or 10 billion people without frying the planet, right? And that was the kind of overarching question. And I think previously I would have been very pessimistic about our ability to do that, because when you think about it, right, so there's 800 million people in the world don't get enough food to eat.
Right.
I would have assumed, therefore, that we are really struggling to produce enough food for everyone, right? We're maybe just on that borderline where we can just about produce enough, and it's about distribution. But actually, when you step back to look at the data, that assumption is very, very wrong, right? We produce far, far more food than we would ever need.
Yes.
So I think that's one area where I went into that question probably with an assumption that was wrong. And then I tried to swallow my pride and take the data as it was to come out with a different conclusion.
I think it's a great example. I think we'll discuss that further later on, actually, Hannah, because I think there's so much more to dig into poverty, malnutrition, and environmental issues too, because people think those things are not connected, but they are in many different ways. So coming back to the work you do is Orwell data, which focuses heavily on carbon emission, deforestation, and more. I think through this research, you discovered that significant improvements, again, have actually been made since the 1980s, and challenging the typical doomsday narratives often associated with climate change. Could you explain again how you came across those discoveries step by step, and how you felt when you encountered these unexpected, again, as this example you just shared, but positive, basically, result? So how did you discover, how did you peel that onion kind of step by step to get to where you are today?
Yeah, as you say, I think we talked earlier about human progress and often lack of progress on environmental problems, but there have been some big environmental problems that we've either solved or made massive progress on. Not all of them, but some of them.
Such as?
I think the very clear example for me, and I would, again, this wasn't really on my radar that much because it was kind of before my time. It was the panic of the day before my time, but was the ozone layer, right? So before the concern about climate change, the ozone layer was the big kind of global catastrophe that we had to fight. And we really have, right? So the emissions of these gases that deplete the ozone layer, the world came together and we've cut emissions of them by more than 99%. Right?
Wow.
We basically just don't really emit these gases anymore. And it will take several decades for the ozone hole to close completely, but it's going to recover. It's going to recover, and that's really a solved problem now. Even if you look at more local air pollution, my assumption would have been living in a city like London or Edinburgh, like big kind of industrialized cities, loads of cars on the road, that our air pollution levels would be extremely, extremely high compared to what they were in the past. But actually, when you step back to look at the data, it tells a very, very different story. Right? If you look at air pollution over the 19th and early 20th century, air pollution was extremely high in many cities. And we've actually done a really good job of massively reducing levels of air pollution and saving many, many lives at the same time. So I think there are a range of problems where our assumptions that we've made no progress are wrong. And you only see that when you step back to look at the historical data. Like if you were to look at headlines about air pollution in London today, they would often be telling you that air pollution is really, really bad. And sure, we can make more progress there and reduce further, but it misses out that go back a century and levels were much, much higher.
So to challenge you a little bit on this one, just to represent all the voices on my podcast, probably listening to you, Hannah, if you take, depending on the way you actually select the dates, of course, of your reference, 1 century ago or 80 years ago, whatever it is, a long time ago, on a number of critical issues, hopefully we made progress as humanity. But if you're taking a different slice in time, don't know about the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years in London as an example, wouldn't the data be different?
No, so most of the progress in air pollution within most rich countries, so take the UK as an example, nearly all of that progress has came since the 1970s, right? So air pollution was really at its peak in these countries around
70s,
the 1970s.
60s. Yeah.
And then many countries like the US had the Clean Air Act, the UK had a similar act. This legislation and this drive to reduce air pollution is what has driven a large part of that progress. So actually most of the progress there has came in the last 50 years.
Oh, interesting. One country which has done an amazing job on that, and I remember vividly because I was there for the Olympic Games in Beijing, in West China. What China did, probably to set the stage for the future of the Olympics, and what happened after that, I mean, you can love you to comment that, was pretty phenomenal in terms of air pollution again. Yeah,
the progress in China over the last decade on air pollution has been really incredible. I mean, I think if you were to ask people to list the most polluted cities in the world, many people would still say Beijing, because we're used to seeing images from 10 years or so ago of massive smog, and that was kind of, it had the leadership as the most polluted city in the world. But China has made massive cuts to levels of local air pollution in the last, most of it's come in the last 7 years actually, where some of these gases, these kind of toxic gases, have been cut by at least 2/3, if not more in some cities. So I think this is a challenge that I think we often imagine that progress has to be slow.
Yes.
But in many cases on many of these issues, we can actually drive pretty fast progress if we put the right policies in place, if industry and technology can line up, if there's public pressure. Public pressure was a big part of this story in reducing air pollution in China. I think I should note, because I think it sounds like I'm underplaying the level, the urgency of air pollution. Like in my book, I actually make the case that like this is arguably still one of the biggest environmental problems we face. Like it still leads to estimates around 7 million premature deaths every year. So there's still a massive problem. If we're thinking about deaths caused by environmental problems today, it's the biggest one. It's actually bigger than climate change at the moment.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of work to do. But most of these deaths are coming from low to middle income countries that still need to go through the curve that the US or China or the UK has been. And the key challenge is, can we use learnings from these experiences and technologies and industry and governmental policies to accelerate that for these other countries? Like, can we, I guess, learn from our mistakes to do it in a faster way that saves more lives? And I think that's really why I try to highlight these success stories, not to say, hey, everything's fine. It's to learn what worked and what didn't work so we can do it better afterwards.
I will discuss some more about that later on, actually, Anna, in terms of the different worlds and the different kind of, I would say, of paths for countries to evolve when it comes to environmental change. But just to finish on air pollution, because I've been learning so much from some of your podcasts and books and so on, I think it was a very interesting data point as well you may want to share with our listeners about indoor air pollution disaster, which I think few people on the west side of the world think about. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so the basic principle of air pollution is that when you burn stuff, you release harmful particulates that you can breathe in and is harmful for health. And when we think about that, we tend to think about burning fossil fuels. So we think about burning from a coal plant or from a car engine.
Right.
But burning wood and solid biomass also releases air pollution. And in many countries in the world, especially those on the lowest incomes, they use wood and biomass as their primary source of cooking and heating fuel. So the issue there is that they're burning this within the homes to cook and to heat, and it's releasing harmful air pollution indoors, and people are breathing that in, and it's cutting their life short. So the estimate is that there are around 3 to 4 million premature deaths every year from indoor air pollution. Now, to be clear, this was also a problem in the UK or the US long ago, because our ancestors were cooking with wood.
Transformation.
We went through the same transition.
Yes.
And I think this is a really an underrated global problem. And if we were able to shift people, or actually alleviate energy poverty, so people aren't relying on these fuels for cooking or heating, we could potentially save millions of lives every year.
That's huge. I like to continue on the same kind of path. I mean, beyond air pollution, I think, as you just made the point, it's one of the biggest issues, actually. Coming back to the food problem as well that you started talking about, I think one of our main concerns worldwide is not just food production, but the way it has actually, there's a link actually between poverty and, again, environmental issue around the world. Especially you've been claiming that low agricultural productivity across sub-Saharan Africa is one of the most critical problems of our century. In relation to that, I was reading the last Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation newsletter. They were talking about 400 million children who are still suffering from malnutrition. They were making it clear that ensuring access to proper nutrition is one of our most effective tools for global progress. So I'd love you, Hannah, to dig into that, to help us basically understand why increasing agricultural productivity in sub-Saharan Africa is actually such a big deal, especially in the context of addressing, again, food security and sustainable development in the region and globally.
Yeah, so I think the recent report on childhood malnutrition is really important as an issue to raise. I also wrote an article a few weeks ago now highlighting that when you look at risk factors for childhood deaths globally, around half are linked to malnutrition. Now, to put that into context, that's 2.5 million children every single year dying prematurely because of increased risks of malnutrition. So it's a massive problem. Why I try to make the case that I think increasing agricultural productivity in sub-Saharan Africa specifically is a massive challenge is that there is an environmental component and there's a very clear human component. So when you think about the environmental impact of food production, to be clear, it's very, very large.
Yes.
And it drives a large amount of biodiversity loss and habitat loss because over time we've just expanded the amount of land that we use for agriculture, right?
Of course.
So half of the world's habitable land, which is ice-free land and desert-free land, is used for farming, right? Huge amounts of land are used for farming. The challenge is that when you get very, very low crop yields, the only way to increase the amount of food you produce is to use more and more and more land, right? Rather than, you think about it like in terms of like skyscrapers or building outwards. If you can't increase the height of the skyscraper, you have to build outwards. And it's the same with agriculture. So increasing agricultural productivity or crop yields is essentially a way to produce more food without expanding farmland into forests and other habitats. The challenge in sub-Saharan Africa is that although crop yields have increased over the last 50 years, much more slowly than the rest of the world, and most countries get much lower yields than the global average. So the average for sub-Saharan Africa is around half of the global average, and you're talking about 4 or 5 times less than many richer countries.
4 to 5 times less. That's huge.
So one is the environmental challenge of that, is as sub-Saharan Africa needs to produce more food for a growing population. If you don't raise crop yields, that means more land and habitat loss. But it also has obviously a very, very key human development poverty angle, where there's several strands to this. So the first is that agriculture is a massive form of income for many people in sub-Saharan Africa. a large share of the labour force work in agriculture.
Yes.
If they don't see increased productivity, their incomes just don't increase, right?
Yes.
So many people there are already living on below the international poverty line of $2 per person per day. Without seeing improvements in productivity, they will basically get trapped in poverty, and that's
Yes.
the risk there.
Yeah.
So there's that component, and then there's the malnutrition component, right? Because obviously that's also key is ensuring food security. So for me, that's kind of a mix of several challenges at the same time. It has an environmental lens. It has a very clear food security and poverty alleviation lens. And then the final component, just to put on top of that, is the increased risks that climate change will put on crop yields and agricultural production, especially around the tropics and the subtropics. So there you've got a mash of several problems or pressures conflicting. And for me, I think a real focus on how do you produce much more productive agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa is a really key challenge over the next 50 years.
And maybe it's wonderful, I mean, to get this outlook and understand all the different issues. Just building on that, I mean, I've been witnessing myself as a French citizen, European citizen, a big agricultural crisis over the past years, right? We've seen that, I think, both in the UK, in the Netherlands recently, in France as well. Well, there's on one end, many less people working in that sector of the economy with a much lower average salary as well, with a lot of social issues, actually. And yet they are also pushed on this incredible yin and yang of productivity, and yet cutting fertilizers and and basically the levers of that productivity for many years, right? So how do you actually solve that issue in the rich world and do not bring it in the poor world as well, in the underdeveloped countries? Because I think that's a huge dilemma we have now.
No, I think it's a very hard challenge. As you say, if you look at crop yields over the last 50 years in the world, they've gone up dramatically. So we've made massive gains in productivity. Yeah. Now, that increase in productivity has been driven by a range of factors, one being access to increased or better seeds, so better seed varieties to grow, but also inputs like fertilizers, like pesticides, like irrigation. And those obviously also have some environmental cost, right? They can cause water pollution and put pressures on the environment. So there is this tension where it's how do we try to provide high productivity and good crop yields while also minimizing the environmental impact of fertilizers and inputs. And there the real focus has to be on increased efficiency of this. And now countries like France and the UK and many countries across Europe have actually done pretty well over the last few decades. We have maintained yields. Yields haven't increased very much recently in Europe, but we maintained yields while significantly reducing fertilizer inputs. The question is, can we increase yield while also reducing fertilizer use? Yes. And I think part of that will have to come through real agricultural innovations and developments, like the development of improved seed varieties. It's a controversial topic, but possibly GMOs. GMOs, where there are a couple of potential advantages. One is producing more nutrient-efficient varieties of crops, so you need less fertilizers, more drought-resistant or flood-resistant crops, so they are more resilient to extreme temperatures. And these will not just be useful in terms of a static climate, so where we are now, but the hope is that we can also increasingly adapt to climate over the next 50 years. So that's the big challenge. It's not an easy one, and I'm sure there'll be lots of friction along the way because there's conflicting perspectives on how to move forward. But it's a tough challenge to produce cheap food because that's important. Many people don't get enough food to eat, and cost is a big barrier. So to produce cheap food while also reducing environmental impact at the same time. Yes.
So fascinating actually, discussion, so hard to tackle, as you say, Anna. Let me bring you another really tough nut to crack, because you are the one to crack all those nuts with data. Biodiversity. At least when I talk not to environmental scientists, I do as well from time to time, but also business people. As you know, I mean, business business corporates will have to report on a CSRD very soon in Europe. And they will have a couple of KPIs on the so-called biodiversity. Wow. Whenever I talk to business people about what is that? How do you measure it? I've got some interesting reaction. It's a big issue. So could you give us a clear picture of what makes biodiversity such a complex challenge to frame it for all of us? And how it connects again, in a way or another, with climate change and some other areas that you are focusing on?
I mean, it's not just business leaders that find this difficult. Even the biodiversity experts or conservationists find this difficult.
Yeah.
Because the challenge of biodiversity is that the world has so many species. We don't even know how many species.
How many species we have?
We have so many different populations of those species, and we have so many different environments across the world by which those populations live in. And there's a couple of challenges there. One is about actual measurement. So being able to measure how trends of different species or populations are changing over time. That's easier for big animals that you can often see, right? You can maybe kind of count elephants with kind of satellite imagery and
easier these days.
Counting bugs or bees is really, really
insects.
difficult. Super difficult.
Yeah.
So one is measurement, and that's really complex. But then an even bigger challenge, if you can measure it, and if you were able to measure it, what you'd find is very different patterns of biodiversity change across the world, right? Some are in steep decline, some are stable, some are increasing. How do you then communicate that to a general audience about what's going on in global biodiversity? It's just so complex and varied that distilling it into a one-line message is just very, very difficult. So how do you
prioritize those issues? Let's say for the business world, we have to tackle biodiversity in the years to come. Where to start?
I mean, I think the key is that even though it's challenging to accurately measure a lot of changes in many populations. I mean, some scientists do, and I think I should be clear that overall the trends are not positive, right? Many populations are in decline.
Yes.
But what's key is that we know what the drivers or the overarching drivers are of biodiversity decline. So even though we can't necessarily accurately measure every single population of species, we broadly know why, which means we really kind of know how to fix it or what we need to focus on to fix it. And I think one key point to make here is that when people think about biodiversity, they tend to think about climate change as the number one driver, and it's not.
It's not.
It's not. For some species it is. Like coral reefs, for example, the big pressure there is coral bleaching, which comes from warmer waters caused by climate change. So for some species, climate change is the most pressing threat. But for many species, the biggest driver, and this is not just recent, this is kind of throughout human history, has really been habitat loss, and habitat loss as a result of our increasing demand for food, right?
Yes.
So either direct hunting, like back when that was a much bigger part of our food system, through to the expansion of agriculture and how we use land for agriculture. So it's really about direct pressure, whether that's hunting or overfishing, and then habitat loss in the form of deforestation or the destruction of kind of wild grasslands. And increasingly the impact of what we use on farms, such as fertilizer or pesticides, on these crops. So that is a useful guide as to how we tackle this and the solutions that we need to put in place to tackle this. We need to be able to produce more food on less land and do it in a way that's more material or input efficient than we currently do. And if we were to do that while we also work on climate change, we would alleviate a lot of the pressures on global biodiversity.
Very interesting. And again, I think a lot more progress to do to educate people about it, to prioritize the issues, and even provide some I would say some tool set to start with, and maybe some select innovations, depending, of course, on the type of issue that we find out. Let me move on and talk about one of the episodes I had with someone I think you got to know, or I don't know if you met with him, Boyan Slat, a founder and CEO of the Ocean Cleanup. And I noticed some parallels between your positive approach to tackling global challenges. Like you, Boyan relies heavily on data to develop practical solutions, in this case, for removing plastic from the oceans and the rivers. But he mentioned that if his organization is still cleaning the ocean 20 years from now, he will have failed. And the idea of setting a timeline for success, I think, is quite interesting, actually quite needed to make sure that we have a real target and not something that is just symbolic. So you're familiar with Boyan's work and other initiatives beyond Boyan's initiative aimed at removing plastic waste. And in your field, you see a similar endpoint where one day the need for these efforts diminishes or this is an ongoing mission. So it'd be great to understand your point of view, both on there's plastic waste, but some other key milestone or dates when you're pretty confident to say, yeah, we can actually close that issue by then.
Yeah, no, I've never met Boyan, but I'm a big fan of his work and the work that he's doing with the ocean cleanup. I think if I go back, I don't know when I discovered his work. It was many, many years ago now. I mean, he's very young, so it's not.
Yeah, he started very young, 18 years old. Yes.
I don't know, it was maybe 2018 or 2019 that I discovered his work.
Yeah.
And I think initially I was a little bit skeptical about whether this would work. Not in a kind of aggressive way. I think a lot of people have, I think, unfairly criticised him and mocked his efforts to do that.
Yes.
But I think early on, I was definitely in the camp of, this looks interesting, but I'm kind of skeptical that it will work.
With scale.
But I admired his drive to do it, right? Like, I think it's just really, really common for us to look at an environmental problem like plastic in the middle of the ocean and say, that's a shame.
Yes.
I think it takes a certain individual to say, no, this is unacceptable. I'm going to be the one that drives the efforts to clean it up. And I think Boyan has in many cases like exceeded the expectations of many people that doubted his efforts early on. And I think I just really admire people like him that are willing to take on an incredibly large challenge that most other people think is unsolvable or ridiculous to even try to solve, and just really goes for it and kind of exceeds everyone's expectations. I agree that I think setting a timeline is really useful there. I think without setting a timeline or a target, you can kind of slowly work away at the efforts without the drive that you need to go faster and to go bigger. And I think that relates to the other problems that we face, right? Like, I think when it comes to deployment of clean energy to solve climate change, I think we would get there eventually and we'd transition to clean energy eventually. But we need to do this quickly because we face climate change. So I think we also need those timelines and targets, kind of interim targets, to force us to move much, much faster than we otherwise would. As to whether there'll be like a final day where all our problems will be solved.
Not all, but do you have any specifics about some of the issues you feel pretty confident, not 100%, that we'll get there next 10 to 20 years? Not 50, 100 years, but 10 to 20 years.
I think when it comes to climate change, I think that the challenge of building clean electricity grids will be solved in the next 10 to 20 years. Like, we're getting there, and many countries are moving now relatively quickly towards that. I think with the clean energy sources we have, with the amazing developments in batteries and storage technologies, I think we'll get there. And I think we'll get there, we'll also be there on road transport.
Yes.
So I think those two aspects of the climate change challenge will be, I mean, it's not that every country will just have zero emissions from these sources, but I think we'll be like a big part of the way there. And some countries will be at zero, right? They'll have decarbonized electricity, and most of their petrol cars will be off the road.
Yes.
There will be other challenges in climate, which I think will take longer. Stuff like cement or aviation or steel production, the stuff that people don't really think about, but is actually really important. I don't think we'll be at 100% clean cement by then, but I think many of the solutions to those issues will be online. I think that will be solved, and it will really be about deploying that at scale. I think we've made a lot of progress on those issues over the last decade in terms of research and development, and I think we're getting pretty close now to actually deploying them at scale.
Encouraging thoughts, and not just hope actually, but work happening on innovation. Beyond innovation, Hannah, and clearly some of those global complex issues we just discussed together will require from time to time, maybe regularly, some global political decisions, some policies, right, coming from many countries in the world, ideally the world altogether, like we try to achieve that during the different COPs of the world. So do you feel, as an environmental data scientist and researcher, that global policies are being handled with sufficient seriousness, and that those in charge are truly stepping up to their responsibility? And it's a big question, not loaded against one person in particular, but the system itself. And if not, what would you suggest to change the way the world climate governance should work?
I think governance on this is very difficult, and I mean the last few decades have been testament to that. Yeah. And I think in terms of global governance, it's far from optimal, and it's probably not where we would want it to be. But I think the flip side to that is the question of, is this the best that we could do while balancing the wants of 200 countries? And I think maybe the answer to that is yes, right? So one of the key changes that came in with the Paris Agreement in 2015 was that it really changed things from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach, right? So previously it was kind of the world will put these targets on countries and you better accept it and you better step up. And unsurprisingly, countries didn't like being told what to do. Of
course.
And the bottom-up approach has been countries, you come to us and you tell us what you can do. Yeah. The positive of that is that countries have got on board and they are willing to say what they will do. The downside is obviously that leaves us currently far away from our climate targets, right?
From the goal,
countries will undersell what they plan to do, or they'll try to pass on responsibility elsewhere. So this is the tricky issue. How do you actually get agreement and keep everyone on board while also kind of reaching for an optimal goal on an optimal timeline? Yes. And that's just really, really hard to solve. I think what I'd want to see in the next few decades is a little bit of a shift in the narrative of actually what we're trying to do here, or how you actually sell climate action and sustainability. The issue or the backlash against putting strict climate goals on countries is that they necessarily see it as a sacrifice, right? Yeah. So the UK might say, it will just be a sacrifice for us to decarbonize at that rate. So someone else should do it instead, or we're not willing to do it. Whereas I think we need a bit of a narrative shift where countries are seeing this transition as an opportunity, right? And if you can have lots of the big global forces seeing this as an opportunity, they will hopefully be a nice mix of cooperation and willingness to work together, and also a competitiveness, right? The best thing in the world for decarbonization is for China and the US and Europe to all be competing to build, the best or the cheapest solar panels or electric vehicles.
And EV cars as well.
Or the best innovations on decarbonizing aviation or cement. So I'd hope in the next few years or decades is that we do see the shift where countries are not seeing more stringent or more ambitious climate goals as a sacrifice, but actually as an opportunity. Yes.
No, and I'd like us to go all the way from the global issues, policies, framing of all the world's issues to personal behaviors, to you, to me, to any listener, any citizen on the planet. In addition to advocating, machine global action, you also made changes, I think, in your personal life to support more sustainable diet practices and emphasize the environmental benefits of reducing meat consumption, in particular, if I'm not mistaken. By encouraging shift towards more plant-based foods, you aim to contribute to reducing environmental impact. So can you share with us personally, when and how did you take the decisions to change your own dietary mode, and which other changes have you made maybe in your lifestyle as well, if you're okay to share that openly?
Of course. So yeah, I'm vegan. Previously, I was largely vegetarian, but I sometimes ate small amounts of fish.
Yes.
And the reason for that shift was initially it was a shift for the environment, right? So a vegetarian diet with some fish, which tends to have a reasonably low carbon footprint, is actually like reasonable for climate and pretty good for the climate. A few years ago, I transitioned from vegetarianism to veganism, largely because of animal welfare issues. I think that has become a bigger thing for me in the last few years.
Yeah.
And I've made that shift, and for me, actually, it's been quite an easy shift. There hasn't been a lot of sacrifice there. Maybe that's because I'm not kind of a really, really into food in the first place in terms of like meat consumption and different recipes, and for me, it's more of a fuel source than a hobby.
And do you feel is it as cool as the taste of your brother as well, or to be vegan? Do you compete on coolism?
He definitely wouldn't go vegan, but he has become much more open to the kind of meat substitute products from time to time, and I think that's actually testament to how much better they've gotten in the last 5 years. I think there's been a lot of improvements there, where I'd say like some of these products are pretty close to mimicking the texture and taste of meat. So I think that's been a really positive development. So I think for me, the change in diet has been really big, and I think as an individual, that's one of the biggest changes you can make in terms of personal behavior to reduce your environmental footprint. So that was a big one for me. I think in terms of broader changes in my life, I think one key change around my thinking around this, and I think is important to communicate to people, is that I think that you can often get caught in the cycle of over-analyzing every tiny decision that you make, to the point where it becomes almost obsessive and counterproductive. And you just always feel like you're never doing enough. And I think the reality is when you actually break down someone's carbon footprint, there are really 5 maybe big behaviors that make up most of the impact. And I fear that we spend most of our time thinking about the tiny stuff that
So what are those 5 big things?
So I'd say in terms of diet, reducing meat and dairy consumption is the single biggest change you can make. In terms of energy use, transport is big. So if you own a petrol car, that will be a big part of your impact. So
go to public transport or electricity vehicles. Or,
so cycling or public transport is best. And then if you need a car, an electric car is much better. And then flying is big for people that fly. That's a big part of your carbon footprint. And then in the home, again, I think people care a lot about switching off the lights and not leaving their phone on charge. And really the big energy guzzlers in your home are heating or cooling. So heating or air conditioning. And that's the big things, right? So installing, if you need air conditioning, more efficient air conditioner. If you need heating, then an electric heat pump is much better than a gas boiler. And when you actually look at people's overall impact, that's the majority of it. And it tends to focus on the small stuff like the plastic bags or the recycling or the light bulbs. And that's fine if you want to concentrate on that, but the risk is that you miss the big stuff, right? So focus on the big picture, the 80-20. And then if you want to do more, definitely focus on the other part of it. But I'd say that a lot of people feel the sense that they're never doing enough, and I think this comes from obsessing over every decision.
Thank you so much for guiding us actually on very practical steps to take. So actually, I came across recently on one of your last articles on sustainability by numbers. about the false dichotomy of systemic and individual behavioral change. Your argumentation is extremely interesting, highly balanced and pragmatic. You argue that this polarizing debate is a false binary, and that actually both systemic change and individual actions are necessary. While individuals cannot solve climate change alone, we just discussed some of that together, governments, businesses also cannot succeed without public support and willingness to change behaviors. So just like doomsday messages can be used as an excuse for inaction, if each side believes that the other is responsible, of course, nothing will change. So can you tell us, through a couple of examples, maybe, how both are actually necessary?
Yeah, so I think this comes from hearing lots of discussions around climate and how we solve it. And you often hear very, very kind of polarizing messages. On the one hand, you have people that say there's only a handful of companies basically emit nearly all of the world's greenhouse gases. They should be the ones to fix it, or government should be the one to put pressure on them to fix it. So basically, it's a system problem. They fix it.
I cannot fix it myself.
Individual behavior doesn't matter at all. And then there's the kind of other extreme, which is, and the message nearly always starts with, if people would just XXX, if people would just have no cars and take no flights and eat a vegan diet, and there's a long list of behaviors that people should change, then we'll solve this. And I think the reality is that neither extreme are right, and I think both matter, right? Individuals doing their little bit is not going to solve this massive problem, right? We do need systemic change. We need governments on board. We need economic change and industrial change. But on the other hand, I think it's wrong of us as individuals to, kind of sit on our hands and say someone else has to fix this.
Yes.
And the examples I use there is that how these two things feed into one another. If you think of the example of electric vehicle charging, right? So a big barrier for many people to adopt electric vehicles is that they don't have accessible chargers where they live, right? And they just can't get an electric car because they can't charge it. So the one of the ways to solve it there is that the government should invest in proper charging infrastructure so that these people can have electric vehicles. And that's true, right? But the government is not going to invest in more charging infrastructure if individuals are not willing to switch from the petrol car to electric car.
Who's going to buy them? Yes,
So you end up in this cycle where governments invest, consumers respond, so they invest more, consumers respond, and they feed into one another. Political will to tackle many of these problems is often very much just a reflection of public pressure or public willingness to adopt that process. And then I think the other example I use there is that it's not just about political change. I think industry and corporations and businesses also try to reflect back what consumers want, right?
Yes.
Innovations and companies move where consumers are creating market demand. So if you think about the example of meat and meat substitutes, right? If you shift from meat to meat substitute products, what you're actually doing there is signaling to the market that there is demand coming here.
Right.
You companies should come and serve this because there's a big market. There's an opportunity.
It's a profitable business,
And what that actually does is one, it drives in innovators and companies to work on that. And then for many of these problems where the technology starts out being expensive, the costs often fall with increased market demand.
Pretty quickly.
So so especially in rich countries, the early adopters of these technologies are not just reducing their personal carbon footprint. What they're also doing is driving down the cost of these technologies
for the rest of the world.
For the rest of the world, right? That's how solar panels got cheap. That's how batteries got cheap. That's hopefully how meat substitute products get cheap. So I think we need to move away from this kind of, it's either their problem to solve or it's our problem to solve. The reality is that we're in this together, and we need
all together, all in it.
We need to create this kind of cyclical approach where public behaviors and opinions feed into more systemic changes.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for bringing a realistic viewpoint on that issue and getting us to move to action individually and collectively. Continuing on the topic of food behaviors and how individual efforts can create significant impact, I love to bring up the work of a guest I had on my podcast, Lucy Bash, and I think you know her a little bit. She's an entrepreneur behind Too Good To Go, an app that is designed to combat food waste by connecting users with surplus food from restaurants, cafes, and grocery stores. And Lucy maintains an optimistic perspective. And in a recent interview, she said, I believe that the capitalist system has led us in a direction that we can use to create a society where life is good, a society where we can be proud of, one that is more focused on human values and relationship with nature. It is a story where we build impactful projects that rely on efficient economic models, allowing us to make positive changes as quickly as possible. On your side, Hannah, you said in The Guardian, there are definitely flaws with capitalism, but we do not have time to dismantle it and build something else. Blah, blah, blah. And there's some more words, obviously, I'm not cutting it. I think capitalism, you said, drives innovation, which is what we need to create affordable, low-carbon technologies. So given those perspectives, which I think are converging in many ways, how do you think we can strike the right balance between capitalism and creating real lasting social impact in the world? And how can we actually leverage the strengths of capitalism to foster innovation while ensuring it serves the greater good?
I mean, it's quite a controversial statement in environmental circles to say that capitalism can play a role.
Yes.
I think there is the argument to be made that some of the environmental mess we've ended up in has been partly due to capitalism. I mean, a core challenge or issue with climate change is that the social and environmental costs of burning fossil fuels just isn't factored into the price, right? Like you're kind of passing on that cost to someone else without paying for it in the market. So there are definitely pretty reasonable arguments to say that we're in this mess because of capitalism. But as I said in the Guardian piece, I don't really agree that it's a realistic framework that we can just dismantle that and build something else and also fix climate change at the same time. So I think we have to try to adapt the system we have and leverage its strengths, of which it does have, while also lessening some of the, I guess, evils or ills of it. So I think the very clear, I guess, positives of capitalism are that the market does drive efficiency and does drive innovation. Yes. And that's what we need, right? We need speed and scale. And often capitalism is pretty good at that, right? And can deliver on that. I think what's key is that we also need, or the role of policy within that is to steer it in a particular direction and to some extent put slight guardrails on it, right? So we kind of want to move in this direction.
Forcing it in a direction.
Policy forces it in that direction. And then you can leverage the benefits of capitalism to drive that at speed and at scale. So I think it's the coming together of that will drive many of the innovations that we need. And I think what's also key is I think there is, for me, there's starting to be a shift in how corporations and businesses have a relationship with consumers, where I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that many consumers do care and do expect corporations to care.
Absolutely.
And corporations need to answer that, right? So they need, and there is some element of, I guess you could say, greenwashing or fibbing or telling small lies around some of these kind of ambitions and targets. But they need to say now that they have a net zero plan and they care about climate and they're investing on reducing their emissions. So they're making these pledges, and I think it's up to public pressure and being able to measure and report on this accurately to make sure that they're delivering. So I think, again, I don't think it's about let's just completely dismantle the system. It's about trying to steer it in the right direction and scale it quickly.
No, I fully agree with you. And obviously, it would be a big topic for a full podcast itself. But I think you and I believe in the same thing, which is what Colin Mayer said with this wonderful book, Prosperity, right? I mean, actually, at the end of the day, the job of a company or corporate is about creating innovative, profitable solutions for the problems of the people and the planet. Profitable solutions for the problems of people and planets, which I think says it all. So we need to really connect the dots together. And it's hard for some existing large businesses and legacy This is also why I'm so optimistic about this new generation of impact entrepreneur startups like Boyans and many others, Lucy Bash and many others, while bringing some real innovation, real solutions to solve some of those issues. Now, we are coming to an end almost, Anna. You've given TED Talks, promoted positive change through your work, and you are clearly a very strong advocate for sustainability, as everyone can listen and on this episode. With all the work you do, imagine you also have to take care of yourself, both physically and mentally, emotionally, because I know it can drive you actually to be in such discussions with many different views of people. So can you share some of your personal daily routines that help you maintain a positive state of mind and inspire you to take a positive action? Or do you balance the demands of your work while staying mentally and physically healthy and positive?
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot because, as you say, to be productive and to contribute in a positive way, I think you also need to look after yourself and make sure that you're healthy to be able to contribute. I think for me, I think physical health is very important. I focus a lot on making sure that I exercise. So I go running and I go to the gym and I sometimes do climbing. And also I'm quite focused on having a healthy diet. So nutrition is also important.
Yes,
I think that's where it starts. I think my downside on the physical health is sleep. I think
do you sleep well?
I don't sleep well. I don't sleep nearly enough. So I think if I was to work on one is that I think I really core for my work is having time very early in the morning to think and write. So I get up very, very early, and I'm not great at factoring that in when I pick the time to sleep. So I go to bed late and then force myself to get up early. So
I know you love technology. You should stop using such a device. I'm sure you've heard about it. I don't want to do any kind of commercial for Oura, but it's one of those, basic connected device who actually helped me a lot, Anna, to take care of my sleep because I see the dial in the morning. It gives me the reality of my sleep, the quality or lack of. And then I've been able, more recently in my life, to be honest with you, had terrible handle of my sleep for many years of my life. Now I'm taking more care of that. And I've changed some habits in my life to actually respect the quality, depth of life, paradoxal sleep and all that stuff. Anyway, we stop there. But please do that as well. Do take care of your sleep.
I need to, that would be my goal if I was to improve on that.
Yeah.
And then I think in terms of more psychologically, the environment I build for myself, I think what's really been key for me and as maybe came through in this conversation is that I think obsessively checking the news is very detrimental to world outlook and worldview and overall mood. So I'm actually quite specific and curated about what I consume. So I don't really do daily news. I want to stay informed. So usually I'll subscribe to say like a weekly
What kind of weeklies? Which weeklies would you read?
Like, for example, like I quite like The Economist. So they do kind of a weekly edition. And it tends to tell you these are kind of the most important things this week. And you can kind of assume that the other stuff you can filter out. Because if it didn't make it into the weekly, then maybe it's not that important. And then on the kind of energy climate space, there are a couple of media outlets there that, like Bloomberg, for example, is very good on that. So I'm very specific about the media that I consume. And then I think from a social perspective, I think who you surround yourself with is really important. I think for me, there are two elements to that. One is that I think I specifically have sets of friends or other people I have relationships with that are actually very far from the type of work that I do.
Yes.
I think I'm very serious about my work, and my work can be pretty heavy at times. I like having people that I can go to and speak to where they not talking about climate change or global poverty. They're talking about sports or something totally out of range. And I think that's important to switch off.
Yes.
And then I think when it comes to people that are interested in the stuff I'm interested in, I'm very much drawn to and try to curate people that are very much see the issues, but are automatically focused on what can we do or solutions.
Right.
I think there's the risk of when working on these issues is surrounding yourself with people that only ever want to talk about the issues, right?
Yes.
And then you kind of end up in this kind of doom loop
Circle.
of just feeling completely helpless.
Yeah.
So I'm really specific, and I'm really lucky at our own data to be surrounded by people that are like that we have a website where we're documenting these problems in massive detail, so we're aware of them and we want to highlight them. But if you actually look at our writing, for example, we're very deliberate about laying out the problem, and then we nearly always at the end say, this is what we can do about this, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So even the article I wrote recently on childhood malnutrition, I could have just written an article saying 2.5 million children die every year from malnutrition and leave it at that.
That's it. Yeah.
But we were very specific about adding a section at the end of this is what the research says we can do about this. And actually, a lot of these interventions are cheap. We can do them tomorrow if we were willing to and had the funding to. So it's communicating the problem, but also giving people a sense that this is a tractable problem that we can make progress on. So I think those are the core things that I try to build my life around to stay relatively positive.
I love it. I think it's wonderful. And thanks for sharing that to all of our listeners, because I think often I have a lot of questions from people about how they balance actually their lives between that hyper mediatization of issues taking over their lives literally. And I think you've done a wonderful job balancing all that. So now comes really the final question, Hannah, because I know we are over time, so I apologize for that. I really want to shift our focus to the future and the hope we can have. The title of your book, again, a wonderful book I recommend to our listeners, Not the End of the World, encapsulate this optimistic outlook. You believe that there's still time for meaningful action. So if today is not the end of the world, as your book suggests, what would be your core message to the next generation, about how they can take meaningful actions to create a better future?
I mean, I think that needs to be the focus, right? Like, I think even when we're talking about environmental problems or environmental futures, there's often talked about, even if it's not completely the end of the world, there is this assumption that the future will be worse than it is today. And it's almost a mission of damage limitation. And I think we need to shift that to a vision of, no, the future can actually be better than it is today. We shouldn't take that for granted. We have a ton of work to do to make it. But there is that vision there if we're willing to put in the effort. In terms of how people can contribute to that, I think the key point is that there are a really wide range of contributions that you can make. What I try to do in my work, and I hope came through in the book, is that even if you're thinking about environmental problems or sustainability, it's not just about these environmental damages, it's about how you promote human development and human well-being at the same time. And that means that counterfactually, one of the ways you can contribute to sustainability is to work on alleviating poverty or malnutrition in a given country, or water, access to clean water. So there are a really wide range of ways that you can contribute. There's the individual behaviour changes. There's the choice of career that you have, whether that's working for an existing organisation, whether that's being a boy in slat and picking a tough problem that everyone has stayed away from and going through it. Or even a key way to contribute is to think about where you put your money, for example. So I have taken the Giving What We Can pledge, where I give every month, I give 10% of my income to really high impact charities, organizations that can make a real difference in the world. So I think the key point is that there's not a narrow set of career steps to make a difference. There's a wide range of opportunities there, and we really need as many people as we can to get on board, because we have a large number of problems to solve. But the future can be much better than it is today if we take the right actions.
Well, Hannah, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. It was a wonderful, inspiring, and a very insightful conversation. I encourage all our listeners to go and read your book, to subscribe to your wonderful newsletter as well. Again, I think it's a wonderful way to illustrate what positive leadership is all about. When you talk about me and the world, well, I think you're the best expression of that. Me and the world is, I can change my behaviors. to change the world one step at a time, and how I can contribute in any shape or form, career, business, corporate, NGOs, to make that positive move in the world. So thanks so much, Hannah. It's been a wonderful dialogue, and I wish you the best. And for the listeners, thank you for tuning in, and look forward to joining you again in a couple of weeks for the next episode. So stay tuned.
Thanks so much. Thank you.